start our second panel. Our second panel consists of primarily a group of our outstanding graduate students here at Duke who have been thinking closely about the content of Dream Hoarders and are going to offer their comments. Then we'll actually have the opportunity to hear Richard comment on the comments. The panel is going to be moderated by our colleague Sarah Gaither, who is a faculty member in psychology and neuroscience, and she heads a research center that's called the Duke Identity and Diversity Lab. And I'd like to actually share with you how she describes her own work. She says she's interested in three main questions: how intergroup contact shapes interracial interaction outcomes for both racial majority and racial minority individuals. And we have a postdoctoral fellow at the Cook Center named Yasmin Irizarry, and Yasmin's interests, I think, closely connect to Sarah's on that in that subject area. Sarah also says she's interested in how having multiple racial or social identities more broadly affects various types of behavior, including complex thinking, social behavior, and identity malleability. And specifically, she does a substantial amount of research on individuals who have biracial social identities. And then the final area that she describes as an arena of her work is what context in particular may influence how people perceive or socially categorize each other across group boundaries. And also, Sarah is going to be a very, very important contributor to our efforts to improve our capacity to think about identity and political beliefs and political practices at the Cook Center. So we're very, very glad that she's one of the faculty members who's associated with our center. She's going to moderate the discussion and I hope inject some observations of her own in the process.
Yes. I'm going to stand up at least for the beginning. Thank you, Sandy, for that introduction, and thanks for everyone being here today. I'm really excited to have our rising scholars here on stage, mainly because as a trained social psychologist, I kind of read this book in a slightly different way. A lot of my work, as you heard, focuses on aspects of identity, intersections of identity, but really social psychology was founded on this notion of intergroup conflict and the types of conflict we see between groups and what causes those biases we all learn through our society to impact how it is we see each other, how it is we treat each other, and maybe the dreams that we end up hoarding from each other at the same time. So I'm really excited since we have a panel today that reflects different areas of research. So I'm hoping that in addition to my own perspectives, we'll have some new takes on what this book, Dream Hoarders, means in our modern day society, and maybe some new directions that we hope the themes in this book can take in applications in both policy and the social behaviors that we all experience on a daily basis. So to start off today, I'm gonna have them all introduce themselves, what program they're in here at Duke, and also very briefly what their main area of research is, just so you all can get a feel for the angles they'll be approaching the discussion today.
So my name is David Romine. I am a graduate student in the history department here at Duke University, and I'm a historian of post-World War II United States, and my main academic focus is on Black intellectual thought.
My name is Eladio Bobadilla. I'm also in the history department, beginning my 5th year, and broadly speaking, I work on immigration history and the history of the immigrants' rights movement.
Hi, I'm Caterina Chiopris. I'm a master's student in political economy, so I'm between economics and political science, and my main interests are political institutions and inequality.
I'm Ajane Clemens, and I'm a Ph.D. third year in public policy with a concentration in political science. My research focuses on police-community relations, and particularly the relationship between the community, African-American community, as well as Muslims in Europe.
Okay, perfect. So to start off, I wanted to have each of you to set the stage for the audience here who may not know you and your work well. What from this book resonated the most with you and why?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. It's actually not my work that resonated most with this book for me. It's actually the focus of the book on the upper middle class and the voice of the book resonated with me because, like Professor McLean was talking about, this is my experience growing up. My parents were absolutely following jobs, but also following sort of, good school districts. And so every time we moved from, in-town Atlanta to suburban Atlanta to suburban Dallas and back to suburban Atlanta, it was always sort of in search of good schools. And so this resonates with me because this is a very familiar territory in terms of the people I went to high school with, the focus of sort of my high school programs, the discourse of what it meant to be successful. This sort of encompasses all of it. So in that sense, it's like, it's treading over very familiar ground.
What stuck for me was the metaphor of the starting whistle. I think metaphors have a lot of power and are able to kind of give us a way to imagine our world. And so I kept thinking about this idea that we like to imagine our society as either being in a level playing field or at least working toward a level playing field. But I kept thinking, what good is the level playing field if you're not invited to the game? So for me, it was that idea that I kept going back to and that Dr. Reeves really drove home for me. I kept thinking about dreamers as an immigration historian and people who are designated as illegal. I mean, they're not just disadvantaged, they're not visible, they're not included in the game. So for me, that was what was most powerful.
Yeah. What I really appreciated about this book was not only the shift from the narrative from the 1% to the 20%, the top 20%, but it was mostly the change from speaking about them and speaking about us and what we're doing wrong and how directly it really approaches the upper middle class. And this raising awareness of that we're making the mistakes and it's not somebody else. I think that was something that was really important about this book.
I really appreciated that it was unequivocal in calling out the upper middle class. That it derided America's hypocritical class rigidity while claiming to be a democracy, or excuse me, a meritocracy, well, democracy too, a meritocracy, that it really pushes back on these social narratives about rugged individualism. And as the key to success, and attributes it instead to assistance from communities, from relationships, and from institutions. It also pointed out the sort of class myopia and self-protectionism. I mean, touting the net benefits of free trade, and while regarding the destruction of folks' jobs as sort of natural and inevitable and perhaps even efficient, in highlighting the I guess, cruelty of the nonchalance there.
Yeah, so I think all of you have sort of touched on a big area of my own work, focusing on this question of identity malleability. And if you think about one group that you belong to over the other, how does that impact what you're going to aspire for in life, or how it is you're going to behave in a certain job context, who you're going to hire perhaps in an interview situation. So I think one thing across all of your responses here is this question of social hierarchies and the role that they play here, and the malleability behind the structures that we have in our society. So I was hoping you guys could all speak a little bit about how malleable you think social mobility really is or is not in our society, either based on your own work or through some of the themes that were presented in this book.
Well, there is this presumption in Dream Hoarders that the upper middle class is generous and sort of justice-loving, fair-minded, and whose better angels can be appealed to with a polite ask, sort of reminders from their peers, and policies that nudge them along. And so I think I understand why Reeves takes this stance toward the upper middle class. I mean, when you're trying to influence behavior, the kind thing to do would be to assume ignorance, would be to assume good intentions, offer accurate information, sort of explain the impact of what's being done, and give someone a chance to correct their behavior. And if we want to really extend some grace, we can think of policies that would operate as a sort of bumpers and bumper bowling that would even encourage success in making that right choice. And so I think that there's definitely a place for this stance. and for these assumptions. I think there's another way to approach the upper middle class, and that is to treat it as powerful, rational actors who are very intentional in protecting their own self-interest, and quite effectively, I might add. And so assuming that there's a sort of more intentionality behind perpetuating this rigid class structure and maintaining it. And so I would call on actually Jim Sedanius, who is a political psychologist and has advanced a comprehensive theory and framework that I think applies really well here when you look at examining the upper middle class. And it's called social dominance theory. It assumes group-based social hierarchy that uses oppression to establish and maintain hierarchy. And it says that the high status group will use oppression, a discrimination that is individual, institutional, and cultural. And by cultural, that is societal narratives, and it is psychological warfare to help prop up the high status group. So the theory would say that it attempts to that a high status group would, if you try to equalize the groups, that the high status group would sort of vehemently oppose that, and that in the case of any sort of victory, like let's say a civil war or a wave of massive elections, for example, the progress established would be sort of eroded over time. As the hegemonic group would seek to reestablish or reassert its power in the face of this new social environment. So it's important to understand history, to know what folks are capable of, but it's also important to keep in mind that there's going to be a bit of shape-shifting going on as people use justifications to reassert their power, and that the impact of what they're doing is going to be the same, but the rationalizations that are used to support that structure are going to evolve to be socially acceptable for the new context.
In terms of social mobility, one thing that's troubled me lately is that we still talk about education as a social ladder. But it seems to me more and more it's in many ways the opposite. So at least for certain people who are not the upper middle class or who are wealthy. So instead of inheriting wealth, many people now are burdened by debt from their education. And we're starting to see this kind of trickle down to other generations, where debt is actually being inherited. And so I think obviously education has its own merits for intellectual growth, but if we see it purely as a sort of way to train people for jobs, and we devalue the other aspects of education, and we put dollar signs on it, we're going to see some real problems, and we're already seeing them. So it strikes me as odd that we still continue to talk about education as the thing that gets you up the ladder.
So I think kind of to build off of some of those issues in my own research, I'm kind of obsessed, for any of you that may know me, with these intersection of identities. And I think some of you, when discussing social hierarchy and social mobility and these groups, one thing for me in my own work that I really would encourage all of you in this audience to think about is what happens if you belong to more than one group within the same social hierarchy. What if you have a high status and a low status identity? How do these types of hierarchies impact groups who really belong in multiple ways? And this is one thing that's fueled a lot of my own work on biracial identities. And if you are half white and half black, for example, and maybe one of your parents is from a high income class and one parent is not, or maybe you're from a single parent family, that's another issue within this book that I don't think was really covered quite enough. So I wanted to hear from some of you about your interests and your connections and the intersections of identities that were mentioned or weren't mentioned, and how you think this book could, I guess, advance our understandings about how social hierarchy and social mobility may apply to these groups in different ways.
Well, I'll just go back to the social dominance theory. I think, so we talked about the three-legged stool and the individual, institutional, and cultural sort of legs of that stool. And I think the cultural part, the mythologies, is where this question comes into play. I think we have to really understand that our society has this baked-in belief that prosperous people are prosperous because they're good and because they make good decisions, and that poor people are poor because they make bad decisions. And so we have to be sensitive to the sort of mythological landscape in the United States. And if we want privileged folks to recognize their unearned privilege and encourage them to be more inclusive of low-income folks or folks with less privilege, then it's really imperative to challenge forcefully dominant narratives about inferiority and poor and working class people. And so I think because the Dream Hoarders audience is upper middle class and we're attempting to sort of get them to swallow some medicine, I understand why there's an affirmation of the values. And so the book talks a lot about sort of I guess the superiority of the upper class in some ways. And it ends up reinforcing these narratives in our country about healthier eating and exercise and sort of upholding marriage and having babies when we choose to, and meeting all those babies' needs and really taking care of them. And at the same time does not necessarily make an equivalent, I don't want to say effort, but sort of there's not an equivalent intensity in the attention that's paid to the values and the virtues of poor and working class people, or the values and virtues that are dominant among poor and working class people, and then the value that those values and virtues bring into a more inclusive organization. So I think those kinds of things would have been nice to see fleshed out a little bit more heavily in the book.
You know, and one thing, I'm going to take this in a little bit different direction. I think I actually really like your comments. I hadn't really thought about how much of an in-group book this really is. This is very much written by and spoken and being spoken to a very, like, really to the top quintile. Mm-hmm. And there is a measure of flattery for what it's worth. Mm-hmm. I really like that. It's really good. I was actually going to sort of pull back to Sarah's original question, and as a historian who is not a social historian, one of the things that I find a little bit problematic about a lot of these graphs and a lot of these charts is the lack of sort of intersectionality that a lot of these the statistics sort of gloss over. And again, to the intersection of race and class, or to the intersection of race and gender and class, and how those things might break down a little bit more if we had, a few more bars. And I know that's a consequence of the discipline, that's a consequence of publishers, it's a consequence of a lot of things, but I wonder, it makes me sort of question where certain people who maybe are biracial, certain people who come from sort of mixed class marriages might fit in. And just in terms of where how they approach and how they perceive things differently.
The issue of affirmative action, for example, I think can really tell us a lot about that. So I think we've done a pretty good job of diversifying at least the university, in some ways the workplace, attracting more minorities, women. But I think often if we look at within those groups who is being drawn in, it's not necessarily the people who are the poor minorities, the poor women. It's middle class and upper middle class women and minorities, and that's good. But we're not looking at, and I think this is one area where it is sometimes easier to think of it in terms of race and not class. So I've often wondered if there's more to be done there. We're doing the work to recruit minorities, to recruit people who have been historically disadvantaged in terms of race, in terms of gender. Can we do more to draw out those who have also been poor women, poor minorities, and people in those situations?
Yeah, so as for the intersection of identities, I would like to connect it to a point that to me was kind of missing in the book, which was, the book looks at how one person is born, where he's born, how do you accumulate privilege, and then it goes up to the job market, you're at the job market, and then we assume that it's efficient, and then the merits, we have certain merits, and those determine where we're going to fit in that market. But there's also a question, as it was mentioned before in the previous panel, of discrimination, and of course identities there plays a role, and not only in terms of discrimination by race, but also by gender, and also for example, the author talks about connections in terms of internships. But connections also matter when looking for a job, and that's what actually matters. And connections really do depend on your identity. So that's one point that to me was somewhat missing.
Yeah, so to build on this, all of you are sort of touching on this idea of colorblind ideology or gender blindness, even though there's not really a term for gender blindness in our research field. And I've always wondered why we don't really have this gender blindness term, when I think most of us in this room would all agree that there are often these intersections between race and ethnicity and gender that get completely ignored, right? This dual minority status, this dual minority identity that might be impacting certain groups in different ways. And so I was hoping I could get you all to dig a little deeper about what are these specific intersection of identities, or how does it relate to color blindness ideologies and just ignoring the fact that we are all from different backgrounds and we're all from different experiences, and whether those experiences are mixed or not, and the access that people have. So I was hoping you guys could dig a little deeper on this notion of color blindness ideologies and how it relates to dream hoarding, or maybe the directions we need to be pushing our society to go.
I think one thing that I find most troubling in reading this book is how much of this is sort of familiar terrain for, at least for myself, who studies a lot of sort of Black intellectual thought from the 50s and 60s. In particular, I can think of there was a conference that was held in New York in the spring of 1959 that was about Black writers, but really sort of expanded on a lot of ideas, and it called into question a lot of what was going on in terms of the integration debate at the time. Mm-hmm. And one of the big fears of a number of the participants, who included James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry and Julie Mayfield, was this idea that becoming part of the American mainstream, whether in literature or society, was a sort of submersion and a losing of identity, and without a race-conscious sort of acknowledgement of what it meant to become American, right? Without changing the parameters of Americanness to include Blackness, people would be giving something up. And I think that, ironically, what they predicted and what they were afraid of, is sort of, in some ways, sort of becomes true with colorblindness, right? Colorblindness whitens the idea. For a lot of people, I think it tends to whiten as opposed to changing what it means to be American. And so that identity, that focus, that defocusing, it brings us to where we are today in terms of the consequences of those policies.
I'd like to follow up on that, because I think my perspective is related to David's point that certainly as I was reading the book, there were many times where I felt that assumptions made about the upper middle class were less true for African Americans that have higher education levels or higher income levels. For example, this notion about education that Eladio was touching on, that it sort of functions as this great equalizer, and that so what we actually see is that when Black folks gain access, then their merit is questioned. That upon graduation, they get fewer hiring offers. So they get hired less, the salaries are lower, the promotions are fewer, the packages are smaller. And so actually the return on investment that's claimed in the book is significantly lower than it is for African Americans. And there's also a comment about what can be achieved with housing choices, and sort of talking about how residential segregation is on the decline, but how economic or income segregation is the real issue. And I would just push back a little bit on that, because we see that even you have African Americans moving to the suburbs and white folks fleeing to the exurbs. And that when you take into account things like class or credit history or income or education levels, that we still see African Americans not accessing the neighborhoods that you would predict they would be able to access. Low birth rate as an outcome in the book and sort of adverse birth outcomes generally are negligible for the upper middle class. That is absolutely not the case for Black women. And so even when they have higher income levels, higher education levels, excellent health care, we're still seeing what I think the medical community would consider confounding outcomes for those babies. And so, and then the final point I'll make on this intersectionality was an assumption about accents, in that in the United States we wouldn't, accents would be trivial, and we wouldn't really judge people based on their accent. And I think that I think Southerners might disagree. I think we have some very strong biases against Southern accents in this country. I think that probably a lot of African American parents take great care to shape the speech patterns of their children and make sure that they're able to code switch. I would imagine that certainly this is true for my mother's generation, but Mexican Americans, many parents in that generation did not even allow their kids to learn Spanish because they did not want them to have any sort of accent that their kids could be discriminated for or against.
So to continue building off of this point, I think, and to build off on the first panel today as well, this question of meritocracy, I think all of you are sort of touching on that based on the identities or the groups that we all belong to. Some of us may have to work extra hard, right, or twice as hard as often people are told, particularly within minority communities here in the United States. So how do you think we should be reshaping discussions of meritocracy? This book kind of touches on meritocracy in different ways, but is there new approaches that we could be taking to acknowledge the fact that based on our group identities, based on these different societies we come from, whether we're documented or undocumented immigrants, how can we begin to step away from this meritocracy belief that seems to guide so much of who gets their internships and who gets hired, for example?
That's a really good question, because I think like individualism, the idea of meritocracy has been so deeply ingrained into the American psyche that I think it's really difficult to even challenge that. And even pointing out sort of the hypocrisy of something like legacy admissions or something like favorable connections, I think there's this understanding that, yes, well, but I might benefit from that. So I'm not going to criticize that, because when my time comes, I want that to be something that I can leverage. I want to work my network, and just the fact that I'm not in the network doesn't mean I don't want the network to exist. I mean, it's sort of Upton Sinclair's, there are no poor people in America, just temporarily embarrassed millionaires line. I think that people might resent the existence of the network, but when it might benefit them, they will take it in a heartbeat. And I think it's one of the things that I really appreciate about this book, is that it's sort of calling the upper middle class on its hypocrisies and its fundamental disregard for sort of the rules of fair play, which was something that I think was a lot more of a common discourse in previous generations, but today has fallen completely by the wayside. No one talks about fairness anymore. People talk about inequality, they talk about what's wrong, they talk about the possible solutions to fix it, but nobody talks about things being fair.
I think to just build off on that, in social psychology, we would argue that when something happens really good to you in life, you're going to claim that personal value for yourself. You're going to say, oh, I worked so hard, I earned that job on my own. But when someone else succeeds, you usually aren't very good at pointing out the fact that there was something in society that maybe helped them, right? We're really good at finding personal attributes or traits about ourselves to sell the winnings that we have in our own life. But we're really bad when we see someone else succeed or fail on looking at whether that's a personal or dispositional factor about someone versus a contextual or situational thing that actually predicted them either succeeding or not succeeding in a certain context. So I liked your comment there from my social psychology angle. Other comments on this question of meritocracy?
Yeah, to add on that, I think this changing the narrative about meritocracy is not only important for obviously the upper middle class, who thinks it has merits that it actually maybe does not deserve. But also, I read recently that even the bottom of the income distribution in the US overestimates their chances of upward mobility. So it's also very important for they live in a culture where that has lied to them about their chances of actually succeeding. So they may be thinking that it's their personal fault for not getting there, while it's actually all this, as the book very well describes, it's all these mechanisms that keep the hierarchy as it is. And also, on top of that, I think, though, that it is really hard nowadays to change this idea of meritocracy compared to the past, because on the one hand, in the past, like a century ago, we would think of the rich ones having the assets and not working, while nowadays, those who have the wealth and the high income tend to be the same people, and they are successful at what they do. So changing this narrative, and so you see they do work hard. So although the question is, do they actually deserve this unlimited income that they're getting, or how do we redefine meritocracy in that sense?
I actually think that the question of fairness, or the vocabulary of fairness, is not so much absent as it has been co-opted. I mean, look at Donald Trump's tweets. Everything is unfair. Everyone's unfair to him. No one's been, more victimized than the president. So I worry that we've yielded the conversation and that we've allowed a dangerous group of people to define what is fair, and to define it in a way that perpetuates inequality and only consistently makes it worse. So I actually think that I hear this word about fairness. I hear fairness all the time, but it's not in the way that I would frame it, or most of us would frame it. It's, again, this idea of loss, the unfairness that the white working class has lost their status, has lost their dignity, some of which is true, and some of the struggles of the white working class we should be paying attention to. But my concern is that it's not so much that fairness is not something we hear about anymore, it's that it's been co-opted.
So I was hoping to get some optimism in this discussion. I think this panel today and both books today focused on a lot of very negative, serious, and very important issues we should be discussing. But I also want to make sure that we use books like these as an opportunity to figure out what we can do to change discussions or to change policies or whatever the case may be. And so I was hoping to hear from each of you about if you could change the world, I guess. If you could use the ideas in both of these books that'll be discussed today, what are some of the potential solutions that you think books like these suggest for our society? What are the directions we should be going? Are there certain policies you think we should be reconsidering? So some youthful, optimistic, hopeful answers is what I'm looking for here.
All right, well, I'll do my best. I think that, for one thing, the idea, I think one of the things I think this book does really well is it takes this idea of the way in which class discourse in this country has been silenced, and it's trying, I think what Professor Reeves is trying to do, or Dr. Reeves, excuse me, is trying to let's actually have a conversation about what it means to be wealthy. And I've seen other stories and other sort of news magazines about what it means to actually be rich, right? I have actually been sitting on a boat in the Caribbean with somebody who makes 7 figures a year and who have told me with a straight face that they are not rich. Because look, over there's Larry Ellison's yacht. And he makes $7 billion, $70 billion, he's worth $100 billion, I don't know how much money. It's more money than I will ever even be able to comprehend. But I'm not rich. No, you pay, you live in a 6,000 square foot Manhattan apartment. It's really sort of amazing. And so to be able to have a frank conversation about this, I think is the first step. It needs to go so much further than that. And again, like I said, this is a book that I want to buy 20 copies and give this to my relatives and a lot of my friends.
He's very excited about that.
I'm still a grad student, so not going to be able to.
Not today.
Not today. Maybe in a year or two. But the point is that this, like I said before, this is a very in-group book. I think this is a book that is really good to use to speak to people who kind of come from the same background and identity that I do, and I who have different political views and have really bought into the meritocracy thing, to the point where you talk about raising taxes to pay for better schools, and they say, well, do you want to pay for that? I think, yes, I would actually very much like to pay for that. And I'm looked upon as the odd one. So in that sense, I think it's really good for starting conversations and having honest conversations about opportunity hoarding as something that will make people very uncomfortable at dinner parties in liberal households.
Right.
So.
Think about who you choose to help on a daily basis.
Exactly.
When you leave this conference today, who are you going to go help at lunch or in your next class or wherever it is you work, right? Think about who you help and who you don't help and what those motivations are that are pushing you in those decisions. That will make you all good social psychologists, I would argue. Other comments on optimistic views of what we can do?
Well, I would like to underline that, so I like two in particular of the policies that he proposes. And one is the focus on high school, because I really realized since I've been here how the things I'm good at are not really what I was born being good at, but really what teachers I've had in high school who taught me well to do. So that, and I really realized what a big impact high school teachers have, and that's really the crucial moment when you decide your future things. So this very realistic proposal of improving the quality of teachers in poor neighborhoods, that is, I think that is a very, very important point. And also talking about desegregation, that, I mean, if we actually do see desegregation in the US, I guess that also is not valuable, not only per se, but also to really, going back to David's point, make people realize how rich they actually are. Because when actually, this is my experience coming from Europe, moving here, I suddenly felt I was so poor compared to everybody else. But the reason is that I just don't see the actual poor people in respect to the situation in Europe is. So by actually, going to the same places, living actually together really makes you realize what the privilege that you have here. And if you don't see those who are actually disadvantaged, you will not develop this empathy and this willingness also to pay more taxes to pay for education, for example.
I'm not sure if some of you saw the article that just came out from the National Geographic, but it lists the top 25 happiest cities in the United States. And the #1 city is in Boulder, Colorado, pretty close to where I grew up, which actually does look a little bit like Disneyland, to be honest. But the median house there is $1 million, and they're going through an affordable housing crisis. And so I really thought that the policy issues that have been identified in this book are great. They're salient, they're doable, and they will make an impact, and they're relevant. They're relevant on the substance, and they're relevant on the symbolism. And so I really, really appreciated that these were sort of not obviously identifiable things. So I appreciated the sort of the novelty of bringing them together and the fact that they were so well explained and so well justified and that they are actually doable items.
I have some hope just because of how bad things are. There's nowhere to go but
Is that optimistic? I don't know if that's optimistic.
Let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. So I like to tell this one example of these folks in, I couldn't tell you the town, but in South Carolina, this 3%er militia group and Black Lives Matter have actually been working together over the past few months to have community meetings about race and class and about injustice for different communities, about loss of jobs. They've tried to have an ongoing discussion about how to understand each other, how to talk to each other. They've collected goods for the various natural disasters. And so I think when things get bad enough like this and when you start to have difficult and awkward conversations with people, there is nowhere but up to go. And so I do have some hope that as we start to see the real problems, as books like Dr. Reeves teach us about the larger problems, we hear a lot about the 1%, but there's, again, this other sort of group that we don't talk about as much. And as we have conversations with each other, as uncomfortable as they are, I think that there's some hope there.
Yeah, I think for me, my optimism is this is a very exciting time, I think, for anyone in this room who studies aspects of inequality or race or gender, because we're seeing a huge shift in our U.S. society right now. It's the first time in modern U.S. history, right before we colonized here and unfortunately killed a lot of Native Americans, but for the first time in modern U.S. history, right, there are more non-white people than white people being born in the United States. And so for me, as someone who studies identity and groups and hierarchy and how it is we interact with each other, the types of discussions, they're increasing across the nation right now. Maybe not always in positive ways, but at least we're having more discussions about some of these groups that I think, because they're rising in number, yes, the power shifts, the power structures are going to take a while to change. There's at least more voices now to try and work together, to try and make our groups heard, who have often gone unnoticed through a lot of these discussions of inequality, I think, to date. So at this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Reeves up to provide his comments and feedback on our wonderful panelists today. And so quick optimistic applause for all of our student panelists here. You can go there. You can use that, and
Does
then
this
if
work?
you have direct questions for our panelists too, I'm sure they would. Sure, yeah.
Thank you. Is this working? Some sort of technology. Do I need it?
Because they're live streaming. Is this on now? On now? No?
There it goes.
Here we go.
It's working now. No? Still not working. Maybe try the other one. Hello? Hello? Hello?
I can also, let me give you this.
Oh, now it
Here.
works.
No. They want to record you.
Right, you need. Is this one working? Yes, this one's working. Okay. I think that one's working now too. Anyway, so I thought I'd just offer some responses to the comments and then see where the conversation goes. So first of all, thank you all very much for reading the book and for your really thoughtful comments. I haven't done anything like this before, where I've sat and listened to people who've really engaged with the arguments, offer their critique. So that was really, really interesting and uncomfortable. Surprisingly uncomfortable, especially when you really nailed it. That's true. So I thought I'd just, rather than sort of go one by one, is to sort of bring out some of the themes that I think, and I won't remember who said which bit anyway. And I thought I'd say something about the ideology point, something about the identity point, and something about the change strategy point, broadly. So I think the ideology point, which came up pretty deeply, which is this idea of meritocracy, the level playing field not being level, the sense that the upper middle class to use, I think it was Barry Switzer said it first, born on third base thinking they hit a triple. But actually, listening to your comments, what struck me now is that, of course, the upper middle class are meritocrats when it suits them.
Right.
And not when it doesn't. So we justify our position in using the ideology of kind of meritocracy and so on, but then quite happily cheat in ways that are flagrantly unmeritocratic on the grounds that, well, everyone's doing it, and I'm justified in doing it for myself and my kids, right? And so you'll see, like in some of the internship, legacy preferences, hiring decisions and so on, even when they know, we know we're being anti-meritocratic, we still do it. And yet we'll turn around and justify inequality on meritocratic grounds. So, and I think this deep hypocrisy, one of you used that kind of phrase, is really what I was after. But I really wanted to expose what I think is the deep hypocrisy around the ideology of meritocracy and the way it serves the purposes of stratification in the US. And that really, I think, came out very strongly in your comments. And that's why it is, as a couple of you said, it's very much an in-group book. It's written by someone from an upper middle class perspective, directed at people who are upper middle class in a deliberate attempt to make them feel uncomfortable. And that's partly why it doesn't tackle some of the other issues of identity, such as race, for example, as strongly as in my other work, because primarily it is mostly a white audience, and I'm trying to kind of, in this book anyway, make them feel guilty about their class position, which by extension I think is also about their race position. But I'm focusing on the former as part of my attempt to kind of start the conversation. Having said that, I do think the issues of intersectionality and race are important. And as I said in the earlier kind of panel, I think one of my regrets is that I didn't say more about that. You know, you're absolutely right to point out that infant mortality rates are higher for college educated black Americans than they are for high school educated white Americans. If you're a median income black family, your kids go to a much poorer quality high school than if you're a median income white family. If you're a median income black family, you have almost no wealth, whereas if you, and so on and so on. And so there's a whole series of issues. And I think one of the problems with the way we focus on race and class and income is that we as social scientists, we sometimes control away all the things that define your position in that racial category. So my colleagues are were very keen to sort of say, well, once you control for X, Y, Z, then there isn't much of a race gap. But what you've done is you've just taken many of the X, Y, and Z are the things that are definitional of being black in America, say. And so you control away the very things that account for race, but you can then turn around and say, yeah, but I've controlled for everything, there's no race gap. So I do, and I think that's something that we really do struggle with. So I'm very glad that you made that point. I guess on the identity, I love the point about accent. I'd like to talk more about that. And I think you're right. It was a passing comment, but you've really made me kind of think about the fact that might be a bigger part of it than I had previously been thinking about. I think said a bit about, I think more on gender would have been good too. I think particularly when we come to race, and then you cut across that with gender, then that's when I think things get really interesting. And it's very interesting to me that when you poll, as Pew did recently, and you ask people about gender roles, black Americans are twice as likely to say that it's important for mothers to be able to financially support their family as white Americans are. It's a striking difference. And as you kind of think about so when we think about this kind of idea of merit and work and so on, there are very big racial gaps in terms of how people think about gender roles, which I think are playing out in really interesting ways now. So I'd love to talk more about that. In terms of the last thing I guess I would say is the change strategy. And I think there were some really strong points. I can't remember, what's your name? Ajane. I think Ajane made this point most strongly, which is I'm kind to them. It's interesting, most of my criticism has been that I'm too mean to them. So it's quite nice to think but you're right, the better angels approach, you're right, the strategy here is to expose the hypocrisy, make people feel uncomfortable, and hope that will do enough to begin changing social norms sufficiently to change the political culture to actually bring about the policy changes that are there. And I might be wrong about that. And your point about powerful, rational self-interest is one I take quite seriously. I don't know where I go with that, though, because if that's the case, then what that means is that the bottom 80% need to get organized and take us on, all right? And that is because if we ain't gonna give this stuff up willingly, despite having read my book, and I'm...
That would kill us.
What? Say again? Yeah.
We get lynching, crackdowns,
yeah.
We get repressed and crushed every time we try to rise up.
Right. And so I think I take that seriously. And so people have said, well, just organize. These people are the enemy, effectively. They're going to keep doing this. It's in their interest to do it. Great. If I saw any prospect of a successful of a movement based on that approach, I probably wouldn't have written this book. I have and I could be completely wrong about this, I've genuinely come to believe that the ideology of meritocracy and class and identity in the US and the overlay of race and racism stands in the way of the creation of an effective working class movement in the US to change all of this. 90% of Americans define themselves as middle class. We've got the legacy of racism and so on. And I honestly think if we were going to have that kind of movement, it would have been recently. I think we've just actually run a pretty good trial in what circumstances could we actually generate a proper movement to reduce inequality. Well, how about a massive recession, galloping income inequality, the election of the first black and very liberal by American standards president, and see what happens. And what happened? And I think we see the results. And so I actually think we've got to tackle it from the other end. I think we've got to get into the belly. We've got to get into the minds and homes and communities of the upper middle class. Because if they remain rationally self-interested and protect, then I think they're going to keep winning. And so actually, I may be wrong about this, but I think we have to kind of change the mind. The last thing I'll say about education, I kind of covered this before. The great equalizer, according to Horace Mann, the great stratifier. So I think education, particularly post-secondary education, is in principle a great equalizer, in practice a great stratifier. It actually takes the inequality that it's given and amplifies it. And the way that the US education system just ruthlessly reproduces class advantage is the one thing I really want people to draw people's attention to in every institution I go into, including ones like this. At least let's be honest about that fact. Let's stop pretending that the way the education system works is in this great equalizing way. Let's just admit that it's a system for class closure and class stratification, right? And then defend that. Because at the end of the day, I just want to start a conversation with this book. I think one of you said it makes it uncomfortable. Boy, does it make for uncomfortable conversations. And I could be wrong about lots of the stuff that's in this book, and I'm changing my mind about some of it all the way along. But it seems to me that unless we get some self-reflection, unless we kind of have a different kind of conversation about inequality, one that's more intimate and more difficult, then I can't see the change really happening. So I'd like to push a bit more on the race intersectionality kind of point and how the argument could be framed differently. So if anybody on the panel, if I were to do it again, without losing the bits you liked about it, how would you reframe the dream hoarding argument if you were to take a more intersectional approach to it? I'd love to hear people's views on that. I'm writing it again, but from a race as well as a class perspective.
This is a question they did not prepare in advance. So.
Clearly. Well, I think it's simply a mistake to think of them as separate in the American context. I mean, it's impossible to really talk about race without talking about class and really addressing class inequality without looking at the historical trajectory of race. So I think just paying more attention to how one reinforces the other might produce some conversations worth discussing.
Yeah. And also, how does race or this very racially diverse society that the U.S. has impact the willingness of the upper middle class to redistribute? So having this, again, different identities, how does it shape the willingness of giving back to the ones who are of lower classes but also of a different color? And it seems to me that it's a lot easier for European societies who are mostly all white to give to people of lower classes than to Americans who have just this different identities, to put it back to the intersectionality.
So as a historian, I would say that what's really, what's present, but I think could be explored in more depth, is the racial motivation behind a lot of these sort of the development of the meritocracy argument, right? The idea of meritocracy, the idea of colorblindness came about as a result of African American claims on U.S. citizenship, on drawing attention to their second-class status, on making strides in civil rights, right? And that is also the prime driver of the development of the new right? Of Goldwater, of Nixon, of this move away from the sort of redistributive practices sort of characterized by the New Deal, which not sort of racially, blind by any, or not racially conscious by any measure, but once it became clear that people were going to sort of have to be taken, once it became clear that redistributive set of policies was going to be applied to everyone equally, the game was changed to a meritocracy. So then you have this meritocracy that's being called out on its hypocrisy, and we're going to change it to something else. Well, the historian in me says, well, yes, but we're going to just see a repeat, right, of the same sort of, a new method, a new grandfather clause, a new poll tax, a new sort of ostensibly neutral and yet effectively racist policy could very easily replace meritocracy. So rather than perhaps changing meritocracy, maybe. I mean, and that's what I do like about this, right? I mean, it is, I was telling my wife about your book last night, and I said, it's a very sort of excellent use of guilt as social policy. And she says, well, do you think that's enough? And I said, no, but it's a good start, right? Like, let's use guilt to make people uncomfortable. Let's use this, and then let's also remind people that violence is imperative. Right? Violence is ever present in this system, and will be more so as change begins to occur.
I want to add on a little bit to that, and that as someone who studies racial identity threat, gender identity threat, when you make someone feel guilty, when you directly say you are racist, you are sexist, you are biased, you are the richest, you are the dream hoarders, right? When you apply these labels on people, it's not necessarily going to help our conversations. So I think for me, that's one thing with this book that I know who the audience was for, but calling people out for what they are is great, but not all people are going to respond to that in a way that's going to make them more communal and change their behaviors, right? So this question of culture for me on the US on average thinks very individualistically, right? And there are other cultures we know who think more communally. So how can we get people to shift thinking more about our group as a whole or our society as a whole, or these groups that get left out of these conversations, without making them feel so threatened that they're like, nah, that's not me, right?
Yeah, and I actually reflecting on this, I wonder if one of the many reasons that I didn't address race in the book really hardly at all is because to add white guilt to class guilt is quite a heavy dose. And I think a lot of people are doing that, by the way. I think just in terms of the intellectual division of labor, I think that there's vibrant and good writing and argument about race and about white consciousness, and I think that's happening to some extent. So it's literally just in terms of like, where is there a space in the market, intellectual market, what's not being said. So that's almost that's like an editorial justification, but it is kind of partly that. I always think meritocracy has been weaponized for racist terms. Because it's like, well, we're a meritocracy, so what's wrong with you? So that has an additional dimension in the US, which is not true elsewhere, and it certainly wasn't part of the young dystopia that kind of kicked it off. As this last point, does it help to call people out? So I've heard on the panel, great, good for you for calling people out. And now I've heard, don't call people out, that won't help. Well, here's my response to that. I was on a panel with Robert Putnam, and I critique him in my book for being one of the people that says the upper middle class aren't doing anything wrong. I take very seriously this argument about, in some ways I reify them, but I'm at the same time as kicking them. But he said, look, I was told that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And so we did this whole thing and he said, Rich is the vinegar, I'm the honey. My view is that there are plenty of books and arguments which outline class inequality and growing inequality in the US, and which basically absolve the upper middle class of responsibility for that inequality. Putnam does so explicitly. He says this is a book without villains. Right? There are no villains. And I say explicitly, there are villains, and you're among them. Now, that might not help. You're right. That might not help. But we try the other way. Right?
Yeah.
If people want to find books about how bad inequality is and class inequality is, well, take your pick. There's hundreds of them out there. And look, I might be wrong, but at least I'm forcing them to have the conversation. So even if everybody that reads the book profoundly disagrees with me that they're dream hoarding, profoundly disagrees with my ideas, at least I force them to have the argument. At least if just glance in the mirror and be sure you're not the face of inequality. Just have a look, because you might be. And so yes, it's deliberately provocative. It's deliberately discomforting. It has generated interesting emails and radio phone-ins, and I've been accused of all kinds of things. And look, this is really difficult stuff. But I think that the strategy of appealing to enlightened self-interest, of saying it's not your fault, I actually don't think that's worked. And I think it's time for a much more uncomfortable conversation. I would add the one on race, by the way. I actually think, let's have an uncomfortable conversation. Let's have a conversation that makes you feel a bit queasy, because I'm tired of the comfortable ones. We've been having those for a very, very long time.
They don't work.
And there's, I could be wrong.
I'm not saying we shouldn't
Worth a
have
try.
uncomfortable conversations.
It's worth a try, isn't
Yeah.
it? And at the very least, if I can unsettle the narrative, the self-satisfied meritocratic narrative that has gripped the American upper middle class, if I can just briefly, momentarily unsettle it for a while, then I will consider it to have been a success.
It is 12:30, so I would encourage you all to have uncomfortable conversations at lunch with our panelists, with our speakers. So thank you again to everyone here.
Can I sit down?